The year that I was diagnosed was 1995. My partner at the time was HIV positive, and I knew that. And I started to have like kind of questions, like swollen lymph nodes. I had 5 childhood illnesses all in the span of like 2 months, and so I was really concerned. But I wasn't one of those people that was supposed to, and so I had to actually fight to get tested. I was told no multiple times, turned away, and I had to, I'm not leaving until you draw my blood, and they did. And it was really clear that no one kind of expected me to test positive. They didn't know what to do. And I left that place. I left without an offer of continuing care, an offer for case management, an offer for anything. I left with some pamphlets and was just sort of sent out the door. Again, because they were unprepared, I paid the price for that. And so I think I mostly went home and just sort of collapsed into myself in sort of a state of trauma and pretty numb for a long time. When my friends tested positive and disclosed to me, there was no ounce of judgment in that for me. There was no fear, right? I wasn't afraid to touch them. Like, none of that existed. And it caught me off guard. It really caught me off guard when I was diagnosed and I suddenly felt ashamed. And I heard people's judgment before I ever even began to disclose, which is what kept me, right, from doing that. It took me a long time to sort of begin to tell people and sort of find my way out of that. My own history within terms of AIDS activism has had kind of multiple phases. I mean, I'm of an age where, in the early, like late 80s, early 90s, when I was sort of coming out of college and my friends were dying, and at that time that was prior to transition. And so I was sort of living and ensconced in dyke community. And I think that was the beginning for me of sort of, one, providing care, like showing up, making meals. And then when a few years later, when I tested positive, again, prior to transition, right? So I wasn't supposed to, no one knew what to do with my diagnosis. And so a lot of my activism was around just being simply seen, particularly as somebody who the world was reading, as a woman, the world was reading, as a lesbian, that my activism was a lot around sort of making sure that I could survive. I transitioned later in life. I transitioned in my 30s, right? And so I had, I'm 52, so I was raised with a particular version of girlhood, right? That I was actively told that I could be a teacher or a nurse. I was actively told, right, that I wasn't as smart as the boys. And so I came into my manhood with a very particular lens about how little space I was supposed to take up. And I know that stuff also leaves me incredibly vulnerable to sexual coercion, sexual assault, right? That I don't feel entitled to other people's bodies, and I have had to work hard to feel entitled to mine, right? In both what we were taught and what we were deprived of as children. It certainly impacts the ways that we may feel worthy of the choices that keep us out of the path of HIV, right? Like, I know that's true for me. I think a lot of times, particularly trans folks living with HIV, who want to access hormone care, right, are told that you need to get, your HIV under control. Well, if you don't have anything to live for, and if you're not comfortable in your own body, like, why bother, right? Like, for me, when I made the decision to transition in 2002, I had 33 T cells and a viral load off the chart because, I didn't have anything to live for, right? So why was I going to tolerate side effects? Why was I going to go through this trouble when I couldn't envision myself in a future as an old woman? So I actually made the decision to transition sort of as a death gift to myself, right? I didn't think I'd be there in 5 years. And lo and behold, like, when you like yourself, it gets easier to fight for a future that you can see yourself in. When we give people access to hormones and access to antiretrovirals at the same time, compliance goes up. I did a lot of queer activism, a lot of work sort of around trans stuff, but I hadn't kind of been in the HIV world probably in 5 or 6 years. And I got a call from Cecilia Chung and from the Transgender Law Center. Cecilia was like, look, I'm starting this project, Positively Trans. We're going to create a national advisory board for trans folks living with HIV. And, I'd like to reach trans men living with HIV. And she was like, like, I've asked a few other men who weren't ready to be public, because you're going to be public. And this really meant, like, I knew Cecilia. I mean, this meant, like, probably my face on a bus, right? Like, that level of kind of public. And my introverted self kind of had a reckoning about that, and I was, in my late 40s at the time. I was white. I was living on disability, so I couldn't lose a job, right? There was a lot of things that, however difficult in my personal life, protected me, right, about going public in a way that wasn't true for a lot of other guys I knew. And it changed everything for me. And at first I was the only trans man living with HIV sitting at the table. A lot of times I was the only white person sitting at the table, right, with trans women of color. And immediately a part of my soul healed, right, because I had been so isolated. Historically, communities with trans women and trans men have been somewhat separated. That isn't as true in particularly Black and brown communities, right? White communities, in my experience, that is very true. That is particularly true in older communities as well, right? When you are raised in a system that tells you that you only have access to this much resources, and that system wants you to fight amongst yourselves, it's really easy to get trapped in that belief. As a trans man living with HIV, how do I talk about what's happening to my community in ways that makes us visible, right, but doesn't buy into the narrative that I need to take away from or belittle what's happening to trans women of color, right, in particular. As even so much as a white trans man, like, how do I talk about the fact that my life is actually not easy, right, but my race prevents me from experiencing another level of harshness, right, that my brothers who are Black trans men with HIV experience in a way that I don't, right? I have no doubt that at the end of the day that I would absolutely put my body on the line, right, for those siblings, particularly for my sisters, trans women of color. I also know they would show up for me, right? And so I think that's the thing that people who are outside of the community don't get to see. It's really easy to focus on all the hard stuff. It's really easy to talk about all of the ways in which, like, that people face immense amounts of violence, immense amounts of poverty, and criminalization. The thing that people don't ever really see is the amount of resilience, right? That there aren't a lot of populations that could get hit with all of these things and still show up and still care and still make a world for ourselves, make community, make change. Resilience shouldn't be required, but it can be found in immense quantities, particularly with trans women of color, and trans folks in general living with HIV, is in the face of insurmountable odds. There's a level of resilience that takes my breath away.